The coffee tasted wrong. I noticed it and drank it anyway, because I was tired and angry and I trusted the person who handed it to me. That was the last decision I made before everything fell apart. And by the time I understood what was in that cup, I was already in the snow. My name is Nadine Whitfield. I'm 36 years old, and I run a refrigerated logistics company my father built from one leased warehouse near Detroit's Eastern Market into a regional operation with 80 employees and contracts across 4 states. I say run because that's what the paperwork says. What I didn't know, for too long, was that my older brother Damon had been quietly running something else entirely, and he needed me gone before I could prove it. I need to tell you this story because I kept a secret too long myself. Not Damon's secret, mine. The secret of how far I was willing to go to protect someone who was already long gone from the person I believed he was. Let me take you back to a Thursday evening in January. Detroit in winter doesn't ease you into the cold, it presses it against you all at once. I had just walked out of a meeting with our family attorney, and the folder on my passenger seat contained preliminary audit findings that would have ended Damon's career at Whitfield Cold Chain before the weekend. Numbers don't lie, shell companies do. And for the previous 6 weeks, I had been staring at invoices approved under my digital signature for a vendor I had never authorized. Damon caught up to me in the parking lot. He was relaxed. That should have told me something. Damon was never relaxed after difficult meetings. He smiled and said he'd grab coffee from the cart across the street, that we should talk through things before Monday, that there was no reason this had to become adversarial between us. I said yes, because that's what you do when your older brother, the one who once carried you out of Lake Street, Claire on his back when your kayak flipped and you were 8 years old and terrified, offers you something warm on a night that's already too cold. I was on I-94 heading toward Grosse Pointe when my fingers went wrong. Not numb exactly, more like they belonged to someone else. My foot felt distant from my leg. The taillights of the car ahead of me began to smear across my vision like red watercolors. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself to pull over. My brain was sending the right instructions. My body had stopped responding. The car hit the guardrail before I reached the shoulder. Metal, glass, pressure, and then white. Just white. I don't know how many seconds passed between impact and consciousness, but when I opened my eyes, I was tilted sideways against a crumpled door, and the wind coming through the fractured windshield felt like something alive. I got the door open. I don't know how. I fell onto the shoulder of the highway, and I tried to call out, but the wind took the sound somewhere I couldn't follow. And then headlights stopped behind me. I want you to hold this moment, because it's the one I keep returning to. Headlights. Behind me. And for 1 second, lying on cold asphalt in a blizzard, I felt relief. I thought, someone stopped. Someone is going to help me. He did stop. He walked toward me, crouched down, pressed 2 fingers against the side of my neck. I recognized his boots before I could focus on his face. Damon has worn the same style of dark leather work boots since he was 19. I looked up at him. He looked down at me. And I saw something in his expression that I will never be able to fully describe. It wasn't hatred and it wasn't panic. It was calculation, like a man solving a problem. He didn't call 911. He reached into my coat pocket and took my phone. He walked back to my car, opened the passenger door, and removed the folder from the seat. Then he walked back to his SUV, and I watched his brake lights glow red through the snow, and then he was gone. I didn't lose consciousness immediately. I lay there for what felt like an enormous amount of time, and the thing I kept thinking wasn't help me or please or even why. The thing I kept thinking was, he checked my pulse first. He knew I was alive. He made a decision with that information. That was the choice. Not the drug, not the crash, not even the stolen documents. The choice was made right there, when he already knew I was breathing, and he left anyway. I don't know how long I was on the ground before the snowplow driver found me. The paramedics told me later it was close to 40 minutes. Another 30, they said, and the hypothermia would have been irreversible. Honestly, I don't know how I'm sitting here writing this. I genuinely don't. I woke up in a room at Detroit Receiving Hospital with a woman's voice asking me to follow a light with my eyes. The room smelled of antiseptic and wet clothing, and every breath I pulled in dragged across something that hurt. For a few seconds, I wasn't sure if the previous night had happened, or if I dreamed the worst version of my own life. Then I saw the bruises on my wrists, from where I'd tried to brace the impact. I saw the hospital bracelet, and I noticed the space on the bedside table where a phone should have been. Dr. Marcus Treadwell introduced himself, and ran a neurological check with the calm efficiency of someone who had performed it 1,000 times. He told me I had a mild to moderate concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and frostbite staging on my left hand. Then he paused before the last item on his list, and that pause told me everything about what he was about to say. There was a significant concentration of a prescription sedative in my bloodstream, he said. One I had not been prescribed. One that, at the dose present, would have been enough to make a person drowsy within 30 minutes of ingestion. I told him I hadn't taken anything. He asked whether anyone had given me food or a beverage before I drove. The coffee. Bitter. I thought it was the beans. We need to treat this as more than a weather event, he said. And something collapsed inside me that I hadn't even known I was holding upright. Because he was right. And I already knew who had handed me the cup. Here's the thing about my brother that you need to understand. Because this story doesn't work if Damon is just a monster. He was the one who stayed. When our father was sick and the company needed someone on the floor at 4 a.m. supervising a freezer malfunction, Damon was there. When I was living in Columbus trying to finish my MBA and our father needed someone to negotiate the first major distribution contract, Damon was there. He spent 15 years carrying the operational weight of Whitfield Cold Chain, and when our father died and the will gave me 60% of the voting shares, Damon smiled at the reading and congratulated me. He smiled. And I believed that smile. Because I wanted to. What I didn't understand until much later was that for 15 years, Damon had been keeping a tab. Not consciously, maybe, but somewhere behind the competence and the loyalty, he was counting every decision he made without authority, every contract he won without getting credit, every year he waited for a vote that would always go the way I chose. He didn't snap one day. He eroded slowly, like good steel left in bad weather. Dr. Treadwell stepped out briefly and returned with a quieter energy. The snowplow driver who found me, he explained, had a dash cam running. The footage showed a second vehicle stopped at the crash site. It showed a figure walking toward me, crouching, entering my vehicle. It showed him leave without making a call. The license plate was visible. The driver had already provided the footage to Detroit PD. Dr. Treadwell didn't say the name. He didn't need to. Before I could respond, I heard a voice in the corridor. The tone of it was what reached me first, that specific register of concerned, but composed that Damon had used our entire lives when something was being managed rather than felt. So how is she? Not how is my sister. Not is she okay. How is she? Like a status update on a delayed shipment. He stepped into view, wearing the same coat from the night before. His eyes moved to the machines, then to the chart, then finally to me, and he was already arranging his face into something appropriate when Dr. Treadwell said it. She wasn't impaired by the weather. She was drugged, and the person who abandoned her at the scene was recorded taking property from her vehicle. Damon went very still. The color that left his face wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like a light being switched off behind his eyes. His mouth opened. Nothing came. And that silence, that single, absolute, incriminating silence, was the moment I understood that the brother I had been protecting in my memory for 30 years was not the man standing in my hospital doorway. Dr. Treadwell stepped aside. 2 officers appeared at the end of the hallway. What followed was excruciating in its ordinariness. Damon tried to sound reasonable. He said I was confused, that head injuries created false impressions, that he had stopped at the crash and assumed someone else was already calling for help. An officer asked why he had taken my phone. He said he'd grabbed it instinctively for safekeeping. The officer asked about the folder. Damon had no answer for that. He turned to me, and his voice dropped into something I recognized, that tone he used on subordinates when he wanted compliance dressed up as logic. Tell them about the meeting. Tell them you were upset. You weren't thinking straight. His desperation gave everything away. He wasn't afraid I was injured. He was afraid I remembered. They didn't arrest him that morning. The footage established abandonment and theft, but the lab needed time to confirm the sedative's origin and chain of custody. They took his statement, told him not to contact me, and walked him out. As he passed my doorway, he leaned close enough that only I would hear him. You don't know what you're about to take down with you. I was not afraid of the storm outside anymore. I was afraid of how much he needed me to stay quiet. Nurse Teresa returned my smartwatch around noon. The screen was cracked, but it connected to the hospital Wi-Fi, and when it synced, 2 notifications sat waiting for me. Adunsprzecza, 48. The previous night, while I was unconscious in the snow, someone had accessed our company's document server, using my login credentials, and opened the board resolution file I'd prepared for Monday. Less than 15 minutes after Damon drove away from the crash site, a password reset request had been submitted to our corporate IT system from an IP address associated with his office. I showed these to Detective Angela Pruitt, who had been assigned to my case. She was quiet, methodical, and asked questions that suggested she'd already mapped several steps ahead. She told me not to confront Damon, and not to take any action that might signal what we knew. Then she asked what had been in the folder he took. I explained. Whitfield Cold Chain, my father's company. I held 60% of the voting shares, Damon 40%. He remained chief operating officer after the inheritance, but in the previous 2 months, I had identified unexplained vendor payments totaling over $600,000. The folder contained preliminary audit findings, a proposed board vote to suspend him from operational authority, and an unsigned copy of the final trust distribution, the document that would permanently move my shares into my own estate. Until I signed that document, a survivorship clause our father had written years ago meant that if I died, my shares reverted to Damon. Our father had created it during a period when neither of us had spouses or children. No one had remembered to update it. Detective Pruitt stopped writing. She looked up at me. So if you hadn't survived last night, he would have had control of the company by Monday morning. That answer sounded impossible even in my own voice. If you've ever sat in a hospital bed and tried to reconstruct how someone who loved you arrived at a decision to let you die, I need you to know there is no clean answer at the end of that reconstruction. There is only the specific arithmetic of what someone believed they were owed versus what you were still breathing. Despite a no-contact instruction, Damon appeared at my door that afternoon. He told the security desk he was bringing business documents I'd requested. He carried flowers and a leather portfolio, and his posture was the posture of a man who had decided the best move left was performance. I made a decision in the 2 seconds between recognizing him and opening my mouth. I let my eyelids go soft. I softened my voice. I let him believe the concussion had taken more than it had, and I moved my right hand slowly beneath the blanket until my fingers touched the call button. He sat close, spoke quietly, told me the police were overreacting. He'd panicked. He'd made a poor decision in a stressful moment. The board was nervous. Investors would pull back if they learned I'd been driving impaired. He opened the portfolio. A temporary medical power of attorney. A voting proxy. A signed statement saying I had taken sedative medication voluntarily before driving. My signature line was marked with a yellow tab. I touched the pen without picking it up. Did you put something in my coffee? 1 second of silence. That's all it took. You're confused. You always complain about that Cart's espresso. I looked at him. I remember the taste. I remember watching you hand it to me. I remember your headlights following too close on I-94. His fingers tightened around the portfolio. Head injuries create false memory, Nadine. Was I supposed to fall asleep before I reached the highway? Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear exactly. Frustration. The frustration of someone whose plan had required precision and instead produced a witness. "You were supposed to miss one meeting," he said, and his voice had gone flat and honest in the way that voices do when a person stops performing. The dose was calibrated. "You were supposed to get home safely and sleep it off. Then you started driving like you were trying to die." He had not denied it. He had corrected it. Under the blanket, I pressed the record icon on my watch, and when I crashed instead, by the time I reached you, the situation had changed. "You checked my pulse. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I could see the damage. If I called an ambulance, they'd test your blood. Everything we'd built would come apart." He said we. "So you chose to leave me in the snow." He leaned forward. "I thought you were already gone." And yes, he looked at the signature line. "For one moment, I recognized what your death would solve. I'm not proud of that, but I'm asking you now, as your brother, to look at the bigger picture. Sign the proxy. Tell the police you took something by mistake. The company survives. The employees keep their jobs. We move forward." His voice had the careful cadence of someone who had rehearsed this. I wondered how many versions of this conversation he'd run through while I was unconscious in the snow. "And the Northline invoices?" He went still. "Sarah's been talking." I said nothing. I watched him recalculate. Those transfers were temporary repositioning. I was protecting liquid assets during a vulnerable quarter. You would have understood that if you'd asked me instead of hiring outside auditors like I was a stranger. There it was, the grievance underneath all of it. Not guilt, not remorse, resentment. After everything, still resentment. "You drugged me because you were afraid of a board vote?" "I drugged you," he said quietly, "because you were about to burn down something I spent 15 years building, using authority you were handed because Dad liked you more. You didn't build this company. You inherited it. I kept it alive." I want to pause here, because that line, "you didn't build this, you inherited it," is the most honest thing Damon said in that room. And it's the thing that still sits uncomfortably in me, because it wasn't entirely wrong. I did inherit the control. And there were years when I leaned on Damon's operational knowledge in ways I didn't always acknowledge. The only difference that matters is that none of that entitles a person to decide that their sibling's life is an acceptable cost. He pushed the proxy across the bed. "Sign it. I'll repay every cent of the Northline transfers. I'll step back from operations. You can restructure the whole board, but sign this first." I picked up the pen. He leaned forward. I wrote 2 words across the signature line. "Not today." Sarah stepped from behind the privacy curtain where she'd been sitting for 40 minutes. Rachel Odom, our forensic accountant, opened the door from the corridor. Detective Pruitt followed with a second officer. Damon looked at my watch. He understood immediately. "You set me up. I gave you a room and a reason to tell the truth," I said. "You did the rest." Detective Pruitt informed him he was being placed under arrest. As she moved toward him, he turned back to me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since we were children, raw, unmediated, without any layer of management over it. But what was underneath wasn't sorrow. It was the look of someone who had expected to win, and genuinely could not understand why he hadn't. "The company will not survive this," he said. Rachel held up a document. The emergency bank order freezing Northline's accounts had been filed that morning. Sarah placed the preserved accounting ledger on the bedside table. I reached under my blanket and retrieved the unsigned trust distribution. Damon had no documents left to take. No story left to control. And I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. Because I think people expect triumph. And what I actually felt was exhaustion and grief. Grief for the version of Damon that pulled me out of cold water when I was 8. Grief for the 30 years of holiday dinners where I sat beside someone who had been keeping a running score I didn't know existed. You can win every legal battle, and still mourn the person you thought you were winning it against. What came next moved slower than the movies suggest. Rumors reached employees within hours of the arrest. Two board members called to suggest I quietly cede voting authority to avoid institutional damage. My mother left several messages. She used the phrase "one terrible mistake" more than once, and I understood what she was doing. She was trying to build a container small enough to hold what Damon had done without having to look at its actual dimensions. One terrible mistake doesn't require a shell company. It doesn't require forged messages sent from a stolen phone. It doesn't require a signed transfer agreement selling your sister's shares for $1. Those things require weeks of planning. And they require a person who has already decided, quietly and thoroughly, that someone else's life is a line item. I was discharged 4 days later in a rib brace. I went directly to an emergency board meeting. Sarah walked beside me. Rachel carried 3 legal pads and a flash drive. Damon attended by video from the county detention center, still a shareholder, still entitled to participate. When I appeared on the conference room screen, he looked at me with the same expression from the shoulder of I-94. Not remorse. Irritation that I was still present and still in the way. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Every document Rachel placed on the table, Damon's attorney contested. Every witness Sarah referenced, Damon called compromised. Then the board chair played 40 seconds of audio from the hospital room. I needed you out of Monday's meeting. The dose was calibrated. The room went silent. The vote was unanimous. Damon was removed as Chief Operating Officer, stripped of access to every company account and facility, and referred for civil recovery proceedings. The board authorized an independent audit of every contract he had approved in the previous 5 years. Our father's attorney produced a sealed letter that day, one to be opened only if the distribution of voting shares was ever challenged. I had never known it existed. She read it aloud. Our father wrote that he had given me controlling authority not because I was his favorite, but because he had discovered unauthorized withdrawals under Damon's management years earlier. He had covered the loss once on the condition it never happen again. Leadership, he wrote, required stewardship. It was not the same thing as tenure. Damon stared at the video feed as if our father had walked into the room. The letter ended. Nadine protects what other people depend on. Damon protects what he believes belongs to him. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free, which is a different thing entirely. Freedom is quieter. It doesn't require an audience. Outside the building, several of our warehouse staff had gathered near the loading docks. A floor supervisor named Gerald approached me and thanked Sarah and me for freezing the Northline accounts before the payroll cycle ran. Others followed. The company Damon insisted would collapse without him was still operating because dozens of people had been holding it together while he stole from it. That's what I want you to understand. The work was never only his. It never is. That afternoon, I signed the final trust distribution. I amended my estate plan to ensure my shares would never revert to Damon under any legal instrument. I also established an employee emergency fund using the first tranche of recovered Northline funds, and this part matters to me personally. I funded the purchase of a highway rescue vehicle for a rural emergency service on a stretch of I-94 prone to winter incidents. It's equipped to reach stranded drivers in severe weather. The first responders named it after nothing. It's just a truck that shows up. The criminal case ran 11 months. Damon changed his story multiple times. The toxicology matched to his own prescription. The dashcam footage, the phone records, the recorded admission, the $1 transfer agreement, each new explanation he offered collapsed against a different piece of evidence. When I testified, I told the court 2 things. I described the brother who pulled me from cold water when I was a child. And I described the adult who stood over me on a highway shoulder, confirmed I was breathing, and chose to leave. I told the judge I wasn't asking her to punish the child I remembered. I was asking her to hold the adult accountable for every deliberate decision he made after he walked away from that crash. Damon accepted a plea agreement after the judge ruled that all recordings and financial records would be admissible at trial. Multiple felony counts. Prison, restitution, a permanent prohibition on serving as an officer or fiduciary of any business after his release. In the civil proceeding, His remaining shares were placed under court supervision, and a significant portion applied against the money he had taken. Before sentencing, the judge looked at him directly. "The blizzard didn't make you leave your sister," she said. "It only gave you the cover you believed you needed." That was the second sentence I watched drain the color from his face. My mother was present for sentencing. Afterward, she approached me and said she was sorry. I told her that forgiveness couldn't be collected on a courthouse step, that if she wanted to rebuild something between us, it would have to be built without pressure, without appeals on his behalf, and without the phrase "one terrible mistake" ever being used again. She nodded. "We're still building. Slowly. Whitfield Cold Chain is still operating. Under independent oversight, we recovered the majority of the stolen funds, kept every full-time employee, and promoted Sarah to CFO. Rachel joined our audit committee permanently. The luxury apartment Damon purchased through Northline accounts was liquidated, and the recovered equity went into the Employee Emergency Fund. A year after the crash, I drove back to that stretch of I-94. The guardrail had been replaced. The snowbank was long gone. I stood there with Detective Pruitt, Sarah, Rachel, Dr. Treadwell, and the snowplow driver, a man named Curtis Briggs, whose dashcam and decision to stop had kept me alive. I gave him a company award. He shook his head and said stopping was just what you do. I told him he was wrong. Not everyone had stopped. That's exactly why his choice mattered. This story taught me something I didn't want to learn. That the people who hurt us most profoundly are rarely strangers. They are people who know which door to knock on, which coffee to hand us, which words to use when we're already tired. They know how to use our love as a sedative, long before they put anything in a cup. The mistake I made wasn't trusting Damon. It was confusing. One act of rescue 30 years ago, in cold water with a permanent character guarantee. People change. Resentment changes people, and love does not require you to absorb the cost of someone else's decisions about what they're owed. If you've ever stayed quiet to protect someone who would not protect you, I'm not judging you. I did it for 3 decades. But I want you to hear this. Protecting evidence is not betrayal. Surviving is not disloyalty. And the truth doesn't need your permission to be true. Here's what I want you to sit with today. Is there someone in your life whose version of care has always come with a condition attached? Someone whose help has always, quietly, also been a leash? You don't have to answer out loud. But I think it's worth knowing. I'm going to ask you something in the comments. Tell me. Would you have waited to collect every piece of evidence before moving, or would you have spoken the moment you woke up in that hospital room? Drop a 1 if you would have confronted him immediately. Drop a 2 if you would have waited and built the case like I did. Drop a 3 if you honestly don't know, because sometimes I think I don't know is the most truthful answer a person can give about something they've never actually lived through. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there, because I keep wondering how far a story told from a Detroit hospital room can actually travel. If you've been through something like this, family, money, betrayal, and the impossible math of love versus accountability, I want to know. Leave it in the comments. You don't have to name names. Just tell me what it cost you, and what you did with the cost. This channel exists because stories like this one deserve to be told completely, without being compressed into something clean. If you've made it this far, please subscribe, not for the algorithm, but because next week I'll be back with something that picks up exactly where this kind of story leaves off. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Detroit, Michigan, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, companies, or events is coincidental.